I'm blaming you, Andrew.
It's not me. He needs to change the host before he exits.
Man, I guess this is a sign we shouldn't be in class anymore.
Okay, can you guys see us or hear us?
Yeah, we can. Now we can.
For some reason, every time I touch something, it says host has ended the meeting.
No, it's not you.
Okay. Let's turn around. They put me in a different room. Like I said, Michelle's church staff is trying to figure out what to do, so they're all masked up, and then some of them don't know us because she just took this church like 2 weeks ago. So I'm like, who are you? I'm like, well, I'm Zooming a class for Covenant Seminary. They're like, oh, okay. Okay. So, and a lot of them are Eden folks. So it's like, oh, the evil empire is here. No, just kidding. But it's a show of reconciliation because you got a covenant prof, 2 covenant profs teaching a class in kind of Eden seminaries. And I wouldn't say jurisdiction, but, you know, God is doing some great things. There's Dr. Rah.
Good afternoon.
There he is. All right.
All right. Sorry about that, Dr. Rall. That's on me. I don't know why I was doing that.
Not a problem. Hope not too late.
Awesome. I was doing some housekeeping things, but you know what? To preserve your time, I'm going to go ahead and skip that. And I just really want us to get started, if you don't mind. What I'm going to do is I'll just have a student start by praying, and then I'll do a quick introduction, and then we'll kind of go from there. Does that sound good, everyone? And so today, if I can, I'm going to ask Jasmine if you could start us off in prayer. And if you can, do the blessings of just honoring also Dr. Higgins and Nathan on their birthdays. We can celebrate God's faithfulness in their life as well. So.
Okay. God, thank you so much for this time that we get to be together, even virtually, God. It's a blessing. And thank you for all of the students, the professors, and Dr. Rah getting to be here today. We praise you for the lives of Nathan and Dr. Higgins, and just that they got to celebrate another year that you've given them, God. Pray that it's a blessed year going forward, and that they would work heartily as unto you and glorify you even more than they had in this last year, that they would be able to say that they love you more this year than they did last year. And we pray for this class time, God, that you would bless it, and that we would have time to ask lots of questions and be able to glean lots of wisdom and insight from Dr. Rah and others, and that you would just use this for the edification of your people and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Dr. Ross, so Dr. Higgins and I are co-teaching this class, and that's Mike's lovely wife, Renee, as well. You can see on the screen. And so properly the First Lady, she did a great job last week talking a little bit about the African-American women in the church. And so we've had some fun times with that. And my wife, Won-Min, who you know, also talked about a little bit with what it means to be an Asian American or Korean American woman. So I'm going to talk, just give the bio, and then I'm going to let you, Dr. Rah, kind of take over. So Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah is the Milton and Bergston professor, my apology, of church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, the author of The Prophetic Lament, a commentary on Lamentations, which I think is great, especially in this time, Evangelicalism, Many Colors, and the co-author of Return to Justice, Forgive Us, and Unsettling Truths, and all great books. Soong-Chan received his BA in Political Science and History and Sociology from Columbia University, his MDiv from Gordon Conwell, THM from Harvard, DMin from Gordon Conwell, and a THD from Duke University, which I will tell you that I have 4 degrees, so you one-up me with that THD from Duke University as well. Rah is formerly the senior pastor of Cambridge Community Fellowship Church, a multi-ethnic urban ministry focused to living out the values of racial reconciliation and social justice in the urban context. I had the privilege of visiting that church when I was in seminary, and it was awesome just to go to see firsthand a multi-ethnic, multicultural expression. And then on a side note, just as the last part of the introduction, my wife said, and this is coming by rumor of her, that Dr. Rah's baby picture apparently is infamous because it was used in advertising all over South Korea. And so beyond his many prolific writing, he's actually infamous because of the fact of his former baby pictures. At least that's what she tells me. So everyone, let's welcome Dr. Rah to our class for today, and take it over from here, Dr. Rah.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind introduction. First of all, happy birthday, Dr. Higgins. Really blessed to be in this class with you. I'm trying to remember when we've actually met in person. I know I've admired your work from afar and have really appreciated your contribution to so many work around urban ministry and justice ministry and racial reconciliation. So thank you. It really is an honor to be a part of this class and you being a part of it as well. And okay, I'm going to clear up that rumor right now, and I'm going to give the whole backstory on the baby picture. So I know it's hard to tell by looking at me right now, but I was actually a child model in Korea. I wish I were making this up. I was apparently a cute baby, much cuter baby than I am as an adult. But when I was 5 years old, my parents put me into this modeling contest in Korea, and I won second place. And out of that second place, I translated that into a modeling career when I was in Korea. And the story is that about 2 summers ago, we went to visit Korea with the family, and we're in this little souvenir shop. And there's this package of postcards. And for some reason, the cover looked really familiar. So I opened up the package postcard. There's about 20 postcards. They're scenes of like Korean life. And 3 of those postcards had a picture of me in them. And I wish I were making this up. So 45 years later, after I did these modeling shoots back in 1972 or something like that, they still have my postcards for sale. So if you're ever in Itaewon, in the Korean shopping district, go to this souvenir shop and you might be able to find my postcard. So that's my little brush with fame story that I like to tell.
That's awesome.
So I have the postcard somewhere. My sister was with us and during our travels, and she bought out the whole store. So if you go there, you might not be able to find it because she bought like 40 of these packets. So she has most of the postcards at her place. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to interact around. I believe we're talking specifically about Many Colors, the book that you've read for this class. I thought I'll give a little bit of background. It's you know, I love telling stories, and this is kind of an amusing one. So I was at this church many years ago, and I had just finished Next Evangelicalism, which was my first book. And, you know, those of you who've written books or know what it's like to write long projects, long writing projects, know how exhausting that is. And you just kind of want to take a little bit of rest before going to the next writing project. And I had either just wrapped up or was getting ready to wrap up my writing project. And one Sunday after church, a group of men and I were playing basketball, you know, after church with a group of friends, and one of them, I think in the middle of a move, said, "Hey, can I have lunch with you tomorrow?" So I said, "I guess, but you can't score on me then." But anyway, we had lunch together the next day, and he said that he actually worked for Moody Press, and he said he had a book idea for me, and the book idea was what would eventually become Many Colors. And Madison, who now works for Zondervan, was acquisition editor at Moody at the time, and Madison Trammell, and we happened to be at the same church together. And Madison had an idea, and the idea was that he says there's a lot of books out there right now that address cross-cultural, multicultural, cultural sensitivity, cultural intelligence was the language that we ended up using in the business community. And that's true, actually. If you the book was written about 10 years ago. So back then, there was a lot of writing and thinking in the business community about cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural leadership, because it was kind of at the height, and we're still there, but it was at the height of the moment when all businesses had to be multinational. All businesses had to cross cultures. How does a Wall Street person, interact with a Japanese businessman? How does a Wall Street person interact with a European, business person, South African business person, Latin American business person? This was becoming normal in the business world because the world was becoming the economics, certainly, and it still is to this day. The economies were so interrelated, interconnected in the business world. You really already had some significant connection. And so you really couldn't do business in the US without knowing the global economic world. And in order to be effective in that global economic world, you had to have cross-cultural skills and intelligence. And so Madison suggested, the business community is ahead of us on this, but I think the church really needs some discussions about cultural intelligence because, and then we begin to flesh this out a little bit more. The fact is the church is, yeah, excuse my crass language here, but it is the ultimate multinational, international, global business, right? And again, I'm using kind of crass language to make a point, but it is the biggest global enterprise. It is meant to be spoken and preached throughout all the corners of the earth. I mean, that's basic to Jesus's great commandment and great commission to go into all the corners of the earth. And so if we're talking about from day one, a faith and an expression that was meant to be global and have a global expression and to be cross-cultural and to be crossing different national boundaries and ethnic and racial and cultural boundaries, it's Christianity. And those of you who've read Lamin Sane's work, he's very clear about one of the most significant things about Christianity is its capacity to translate into different cultures and languages. If you read Translating the Message and some of his other works, it's very clear Lamin Sane, who was an African theologian who taught at Yale and Harvard for many years, he converted from Islam to Christianity. And so what Sane was noting was the differentiation between Islam and Christianity. One of the major one was the capacity of Christianity to cross cultures and to speak into and to adapt to different cultures and to certainly be translated into different languages, which distinguished it, he identified as distinct from the Muslim faith and from Islam. And so in that sense, in our church history, in our missiological history, one of the things we have to recognize and acknowledge is the high capacity and the high, in fact, calling of the church to be cross-cultural and to be able to cross the boundaries that are set up along different nations, races, ethnicities, and cultures. So that's the origin of the book, that it was recognizing that other sectors in society were further along than the church was. And this was kind of building on my first book, which was saying that if you look at the demographic trends in American society, we are rapidly moving towards a diverse America. The projection is still, despite everything that's been going on with immigration rights restrictions and curtailing, the projection is still that sometime in the decade of 2040, somewhere between 2040 and 2050, the U.S. will no longer have a clear ethnic majority. Right now, the ethnic majority is white. By 2040, somewhere in that decade, the white Anglo-European population will be below 50%. So there will be no one group that has more than 50%, one ethnic group. That's a pretty major change. I joke that you can build a dome. I don't want to build a wall. I want to build a dome. Canada is going to pay for a dome. And even after we build the dome and seal off the United States of America from anybody coming in and going out, we still will be a diverse nation by 2040, 2042, 2045, somewhere in that decade. Because the demographic changes are not pegged to immigration, it's pegged to birth rates. And we're seeing this especially in the urban centers, that the changing sociological numbers around the diversity issue, it's not, the flooding of the Rio Grande with Mexican immigrants. That's actually not, that's a mythology. That's actually fake news. It's actually not happening. What is happening in the transformation of American society along demographic changes is birth rates. And therefore, because the birth rates aren't changing, what we're going to get is an ethnically diverse nation by 2040, somewhere in that decade. What I had said in the book prior to Many Colors was that transition to a multi-ethnic America, that transition to no clear ethnic majority, that will hit the church faster than it hits society. And that's when I wrote The Next Evangelicalism. And I said that if you're looking at the future of evangelicalism, and by evangelicalism, I'm defining it very much in theological terms and ecclesial terms, and not in the social political terms that it's used now. When people say the word evangelical, it has a more social political connotation than it does a theological ecclesial connotation. I use it as a theological ecclesial connotation, which are things like high view of scripture, high Christology, conversionist faith, activist faith. These are the things like Bebbington identifies, Marsden and Knoll have identified. There's been a, kind of a theological, ecclesial understanding of evangelical. And so my prediction was back in 2008 when I wrote my first book was that evangelicalism will hit that 50% threshold faster than society as a whole. And I joke that it will be the first time evangelicalism is 10 or 20 years ahead of society rather than 10 or 20 years behind society. And actually, that prediction is coming along pretty well. Thank you very much. In 2018, PRRI, which tracks kind of trends within Christianity and the role of religion in society. Robert Jones has written, his second book is coming out soon, an excellent book about this, but they track numerically the kind of trends within Christianity. And in 2018, they did a survey trying to kind of figure out what percentage identified as evangelical. And I believe the numbers were 17% of American citizens identify as white evangelical, but 16% of Americans identify as non-white evangelical. So already at 2018, we were pretty close to 50-50, 17%, 60%. I'll be interested to see what, because they did these as exit polls. They did this as kind of part of the polls around the elections around that time. So I'll be curious what they do in 2020. My guess is it's either dead even now, or even maybe it's already ticked up, where the number of ethnic minorities who are considered evangelicals might be even higher than the number who consider themselves as white evangelical. So if that reality is hitting the church faster than it is hitting society, why does it seem like the church is 10, 20 years behind? So even though we're seeing it at a faster rate in the church, and certainly denominations have recognized this, Christian colleges, if they haven't recognized it, they're probably on their way out. Seminaries have begun to recognize this. What we're beginning to see is that the future, or even actually the present reality, is that we have a diverse church, and that evangelicalism is almost at the forefront of that diversity, faster than almost all the other sectors. And so we're moving at a rate of diversity faster than the US Senate is less diverse than evangelical churches. Mainline churches are actually less diverse than evangelical churches. You're pretty much seeing evangelicalism, especially in its faith orient, in kind of the faith community, as the kind of the industry leader when it comes to diversity. Yet in terms of ability and capacity to deal with this diversity, the cultural intelligence / intuition that is needed to deal with this diversity felt low back then, and sadly I think it still feels a little low right now. And so that's where the background of the book is, to try to create a practical theology that addresses this question of, are we prepared as a church to deal with the diversity that back then was on its way, and right now it's already here? And within 10 years, it will be everywhere, it will be prevalent, it will dominate what evangelicalism or Christianity could look like here in the United States. The way I approached it, I didn't lay this out in the book, but I drew from my mentor, Eldon Villafañe at Gordon Conwell. And Eldon, he was my significant mentor of mine for theology and ethics. Eldon is a Pentecostal Reformed, the hybrid. They're out there, actually, a Reformed Pentecostal hybrid. And so his background is Pentecostal, but he teaches at a Reformed seminary, and his training is more into Reformed theology. And Eldon talks about practical theology or social ethics, or an ethic of Christian ethic, through three categories, which is clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation. Clarification is knowing your context, knowing what's going on in your neighborhood. It could be as simple as, okay, I'm in a neighborhood that does not speak English, and therefore I need to know that before I go out and share the gospel, because I'm speaking in a language that nobody understands. So clarification is simply understanding the context of your ministry. Conceptualization, the root word there being concept, is theology, the biblical truths and the theological themes and the theological understanding that we have. But the connection is that we want to make sure that our theology, which oftentimes is up here, begins to find its expression here on the ground, in the church, in people's lives. And that's the third category. You have to do the alliteration confrontation, which basically is saying, how do we live this out? What are the methods of ministry? What is the practical practice of ministry that we live out? So I actually had that, I didn't write it out in the book itself, but that was my backdrop of thinking. I want to present a practical theology of multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial ministry, but I want to make sure that we understand the context, which most of what Next Evangelicalism is trying to do. We understand the theology, which I try to outline in the first part of the book, but then we also get to some of the practical application, and that the three should be connected together. They shouldn't be, you know, they should be connected. That's what practical theology is. If you just get to the third part, that's when you get a lot of really bad books in American Christianity. You know, the how-to books and grow your church from 5 to 500 in 5 weeks or less, or your money back. You know, those are the kind of books that we get because we jump to that third category of methods and confrontation of how we're going to do things. But what I was trying to do is connect the dots to say, this is the world we're living in. This is the theology that speaks to that world. And these are the practical applications that come out of that theology. Those were kind of the background thoughts that I had. I thought, you know, that might be kind of a fun thing to look at. You know, sometimes when you write a book, what motivates the book is sometimes more interesting than the book itself at times. But I would love to talk more about the content of the book as well, to kind of bat that around a little bit. One of the things that I've actually tried to build on from this book that actually, good advertising, right behind me, my latest book with Mark Charles, Unsettling Truth, we kind of touch on this as well. And I'm writing a book right now with 2 other co-authors about what is the applicable gospel message for the next generation. And that the gospel isn't changing so much, it's that the context of our ministry is changing. So how do we more effectively communicate the gospel? Not change the gospel, but effectively communicate the gospel. And one of the things that we've been looking at is we have to understand the context of out of which many of these communities arise and what are they responding to. And so kind of trying to build on that, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how narratives and what the scripture calls powers and principalities become embedded into our world in such a way that we act reflexively out of them, and then we can't actually move out of those reflexes. So the language I'm using around narrative, some people call it worldview, others call it imagination. There's a lot of different language around this. Different traditions use different languages. I've been using narratives because they're kind of the stories, the imagination that get embedded into a culture. And this is where the culture piece comes in. It gets embedded into the culture in such a way that we act reflexively out of that cultural norm that we have internalized. And you might remember that first section where I talk about Berger and Luckman's social construction of reality, that third piece of internalization. And so I've been kind of battling with the idea that we have to deal with sin in its individual locus, meaning personal sin, personal sinfulness, brokenness. We have to deal with sin in its appropriate locus of structure and systems as well. That there are, as the scripture says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. That's a pretty clear indication that evil does not just reside in the individual. Evil resides in systems and structures, which requires powers and principalities. But that third level is something that I've been intrigued by, which is internalization. And so one of the things that happens with culture and society and imagination, worldview, and narratives is that all of these things get internalized and we act reflexively out of that internalization. It's like a good actor who embodies a character so deeply. I'm told that actors like De Niro and these kind of world-class actors, even when they're not in front of the camera during a shoot, don't talk to them. If you run into him in the bathroom, don't talk to him, because if he's playing a serial killer, he'll respond to you like a serial killer, even when he's not on camera, because they're trying to embody the character so deeply that impulsively and improvisationally, reflexively, that's what's coming out. And so our cultural chauvinism, our reflexive, inadequate response is coming out of these embedded negative narratives or dysfunctional narratives that we still need to address. And that's a part of the confrontation methodology for me, to begin to talk about what are the narratives we need to unearth. And I didn't say it explicitly in many colors. I'll say it more explicitly now. It's the assumption that there is a superior culture, superior people group over and against another people group. Now, there's language around, to put it explicitly, it's white supremacy. I try not to use that language. I think it's an appropriate word to say. But I think, like, I don't want to fight over, like, what do you mean by white supremacy? You're calling me a skinhead? Are you calling me a member of the KKK? Calling me a neo-Nazi? No, I'm using that word in a different way than it's used, by, I guess, like, political terms. It's the assumption that one group is, and that's why white superiority or white centrality is another alternative to white supremacy, that one group is superior or more central to the gospel narrative than other people groups. And therefore that people group's narrative is central, and everything kind of goes through that people group's narrative. And that is cultural chauvinism. And that's cultural incompetency, I would argue, because it creates a wall of hostility, as Ephesians says. It creates a dividing wall of hostility that human beings have created and not necessarily what God has created. So that's kind of the backdrop of how do we begin to address these embedded narratives that have led to some assumptions and reflexive instinctual actions. And we kind of say what's on the top of our head that comes out of our embedded narratives and our worldview. How do we begin to transform that so that our reflexes are really more godly and biblical than it is rooted in assumption of white superiority? I talked fast and too long for my own good, so I'll pause here and I'll turn it over.
Awesome. No, thank you, Dr. Rah. That's awesome. It's good stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot of fodder that was created for students to interact with you. They've been challenged to kind of come up with their own questions, and a lot of them have sent them, so I'm going to let them do their questions kind of just directly. I'll call on students. If you kind of just raise your hand, just let me know. But I'm going to have one for you just for fun, just to kind of do it. So in our current cultural moment, obviously race, ethnic, kind of this idea of cultural intelligence is front and center. If you were to do an appendix based upon our current cultural crisis regarding race and ethnicity, what do you think you would change or add or do with respect to kind of this book?
Yeah, it's what I just talked about, which is I would add a little more analysis around social reality, which, the Berger and Luckman model with the kind of the circular diagram that was in that chapter. I thought it was a really kind of a different angle of trying to explain culture and looking culture not as kind of this external creation somebody created and now we're a part of it, but as something we participate in, as something we contribute to, but also something that we are shaped by. Culture is not external to us. It's a part of who we are. And I would take that analysis one step further, especially given our current moment, to say, again, going back to, and how have we embedded and internalized these worldview, imagination, especially culturally shaped ones, not biblically shaped ones, but what are the culturally shaped imagination that we've internalized to such an extent that we respond reflexively out of it. So when there's, when we hear about, and, I've written on this in terms of just like more like tweets and blogs rather than in a book form, but I talk about the dysfunctional reflex of all lives matter, right? Because when you say all lives matter, you're acting reflexively, not to a social cultural reality. Because when you say all lives matter, you're not responding to a phrase, all lives do not matter, right? Because that has never been stated. I mean, there's not a single moment in American history where we have said all lives do not matter. So when you say all lives matter, you're not responding to all lives do not matter, because that's never happened. Now you might have said blue lives don't matter, or baby lives don't matter, unborn baby lives don't matter, or women's lives don't matter. But there's been no blanket statement ever in American history that says all lives do not matter. So the phrase all lives matter is not a response to all lives do not matter. It is a response to Black Lives Matter. Now, why is Black Lives Matter so controversial? When I argued that Black Lives Matter is a corrective to a broken narrative that got embedded in. And Black Lives Matter is responding to Black Lives Do Not Matter. And that has been repeated throughout history. So what I would argue for is that we've got to unpack that social reality a little deeper and say, not just the individuals changing the broken social system, not just systems and structures being addressed, but what narratives have been embedded in that we act impulsively out of, so that what we say end up not coming from, again, scripture or our theology, but it comes out of an embedded dysfunction, a social culturally embedded dysfunction. I think I would push on that point a little bit more, because culture is not just what we create, it's not just what we participate in, it is also what we are shaped by, and therefore that's both good and bad. There can be good culture that shapes us, but there can be some bad culture that shaped us. And the assumption of white superiority would be a bad expression of American history and American culture that does need a theological corrective. And that's why I've said in a number of different contexts, the theological corrective is Black Lives Matter. That phrase is correcting a bad narrative that is in our society. The narrative is messed up. The narrative says Black lives do not matter. And if you don't realize that's a narrative in American society, you haven't been reading the history books. I mean, hundreds of years of slavery, Jim Crow laws, the new Jim Crow, the name after name of Black lives clearly not mattering. That's the evidence is just all over the place. And so when the church didn't respond to the world saying Black lives do not matter, the rocks and fields cried out, Black Lives Matter. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. So I would probably touch on that a little bit more to say, how has these dysfunctional cultural narratives got embedded into our churches and into our Christian worldview, and what are these narratives that need to be kind of broken up and addressed?
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we did get a couple of questions in advance. I'm going to let the students themselves ask it. So I'm going to start with Lowell. You're the first to respond. So Lowell, you want to go ahead and address your question to Dr. Rah?
I would love to. I feel like it's been answered in part, Dr. Rah, by what you've discussed, but I especially enjoyed your chapters on history and power, and wanted to ask you to expand on the relationship between the two. It seems to me that sometimes we twist history to keep power, or to your point, we don't know it or care to know it. And so that helps us maintain the current power dynamics in that misunderstanding of history. An extreme example, I'm from Arkansas, Tom Cotton's recently criticized the 1619 Project and his Saving American History Act. I mean, that's a really extreme example, but
yeah.
I feel like we have less extreme examples in the church. And the question I would ask you is, how do we see history from the non-white perspective prioritized in our churches, and white, non-white power dynamics addressed more openly and directly in the face of some resistance, and some who would say, well, those are political things, those are divisive things, those are secondary things. But I hear you saying, no, this is central, this is a fruit of the gospel.
Yeah.
How do we begin to unembed some of those truths as you just discussed?
Yeah, so if you look over my shoulder, Unsettling Truths, that's the latest book that I co-authored with Mark Charles, who's a Navajo Native American who has been kind of exploring these issues. And one of the things we do is exactly what you're describing, which is try to look at truth and have that truth shine the light and reveal our grab for lack of truth, or our falsehoods. And in one of our chapters, we make this comparison. It's a tough one. I got to admit, it's a tough one. It was a tough one to write up. And we talk about how history is written by the victors, right? I mean, in fact, one of the books that I wrote on this was Prophetic Lament, which is a commentary on the Book of Lamentations. It's one of the very few books it's in the Bible or anywhere that actually is written by the losers, because it's a lament, right? These are the ones who've lost their homes and have had the people conquer them. And that's why I think people don't read Lamentations, because it's one of those places where those who have suffered, those who have died, and whose families have died or taken them away, those who are lamenting, and nobody wants to read the stories of the losers. We want to hear the stories of the winners. And so one of the things we write about in this book is the difference between Robert McNamara and Oscar Gröning. Oscar Gröning was a bookkeeper in the concentration camps. And when he was in his 90s, he realized what he had done was wrong, to participate in the genocide. And so he turns himself in, and he's actually put into jail at the age of 90. And that's pretty devastating. I mean, you know, you think about it now, it's like, wow, that's a real strong sense of justice. But it was this understanding that they were wrong in how they acted against the marginalized people. And this is controversial. Robert McNamara was one of the people who authorized the carpet bombing and the bombing of Vietnam and the use of Agent Orange, and just as the Secretary of Defense, I believe it was at the time, some of the war crimes committed in Vietnam. And yet he's actually seen as a hero. Why? Because one nation lost the war and the other nation won the war. And one nation was seen as the losers and the other nation was seen as the power. And so those in power, when the powerful write the history, you end up with a distorted view of history. And that's, again, is why I really appreciate the history of Israel. I mean, that's something we should take a look at and say, you know, Israel was not victorious at the end of the day. And so maybe that's something to consider, that the goal is not to win the victory as a nation in the world. Doesn't seem like a biblical goal. So to make America triumphant as the greatest nation in the world, that doesn't sound like a biblical goal, because that's not what happened to the nation of Israel. And in fact, a lot of the story of Israel, our heritage as Christians that we've received, is the history of failure, is the history of defeat, the history of lament. But what does that open the door for? It opens the door for Christ. It opens the door for the Savior to come, because we acknowledge our brokenness. We acknowledge our failures. We acknowledge our attempts to build a human kingdom that, you know, it was an utter failure. And it actually creates this much deeper need for God. And so truth-telling is important, a part of the gospel, because central to the gospel is the acknowledgement of brokenness, acknowledgement of sinfulness, acknowledgement of failure. And I think in our revisionist American history, we don't want to go down that path, because at that moment, then America, not that it ever was, stops being a Christian nation that's going to uphold the standard of God, but actually has revealed itself as a broken nation that is in desperate need of God. Now, there's a huge difference there. I think the second thing that I said is probably more biblical than the first thing I said. And that's where I would say the reason we need honesty in history, just like in the Old Testament, is that it points us towards God in a way that this kind of triumphalistic, make America great again, America number one, only America, that language doesn't help us turn to God. It helps us turn to our political powers and say, hey, you know, these are the ones that are going to save us. But ultimately, the one that saves us is Christ. And we really can't turn towards Christ when we think we have a savior in the world. We really can't turn towards Christ as our hope when we have hope in other things besides Jesus in the world. So that would be kind of my kind of rant to say how much we need truth-telling, because truth-telling, just like the scriptures testifies, when you know the truth sets you free, and the truth is we are broken people, and to not acknowledge that is an affront to the holiness of God. And that's why I think truth-telling in our history is absolutely necessary, because it does turn us more towards God rather than some of the lies that we've been kind of telling ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rah. I will caution you, by the way, half this class is military in some way, shape, or form, including Colonel Higgins, just as a quick FYI. But anyhow, let me move over to Devin. Devin sent in some questions, and I'll do a free-for-all. I'll go to James after I see James's hand. So Devin, go ahead.
Dr. Rah, thanks for being here. I was really challenged by many colors, and then I just finished Unsettling Truths a couple weeks ago as well, and really enjoyed it quite a bit as well. So thank you. And my question is, so you speak about multicultural churches building a third culture, basically. That's the situation that my wife and I are in, is a multicultural church that I think has tried to intentionally build a third culture. But my question is, I'm curious how third culture is taught explicitly through discipleship or formation, or having like, process conversations versus like how it's caught implicitly through community. You quote Eric Law a lot, the Will She Dwell with the Lamb, and that he kind of, I know one of his big takeaways is like setting ground rules for process and things like that, which is like super helpful. But I'm curious, like, if you have any other good examples of how that's worked, either explicitly or implicitly through picking up in community, if that makes sense.
And just a quick note, jumping back, my gratitude and my heartfelt honoring of the veterans and the military folks here. My niece is a veteran, and she's actually retired from the Army. She's young, but she retired from the Army recently as a captain. And so my respect for that, my concern is more how military is misused rather than the existence of the military.
You're good. You're safe. I just wanted to caution you.
No, I'm good. I'm good. And going back to your question, I would distinguish, and I think I do this in the book, between third culture, which I think is where we tend to go towards, versus what Villafañe talks about. I think I mentioned the triple consciousness idea. So there's a subtle difference, but I would gravitate more towards the triple consciousness idea. The third culture idea, the problem with that, and I think it's kind of the go-to, because what third culture approach acknowledges is that you will form a culture in some form or another. That's like a given. Even if it's a amalgamation of all the cultures that come into your group, or it leans towards one culture versus another, the reality is every church forms a culture of some kind or another. The problems oftentimes, though, is that third culture can become the new oppressive culture. And I don't mean that in like, it's going to kill people in the church. I mean that it becomes the culture that everybody has to adapt to and become like. And if they don't fit in that third culture, then they have to go away, right? So I do want to distinguish that, because the third culture assumes that there is a concrete culture that you're supposed to build, a specific culture you're supposed to build, and then everybody has to adapt to that specific culture. I do think that happens, but I think there needs to be an awareness of that reality. That's why I switched to triple consciousness language, which is not so much the creation of a specific, concrete, tangible culture that everybody has to kind of adapt to and get to know, right? Versus a sensitivity, an intuition, a consciousness that allows you to operate in multiple cultures. That is more discipleable than the first. The first is actually easy to transition into, right? So if you have a third culture and you've created the metrics around that third culture, so there's a certain even though you have folks from this culture here, this culture there, you've created a third culture where the music is a blend of the two, but it is recognizable that this is the kind of music we sing, not this, this is what we do. So you've created the kind of the spectrum that I talked about of cultural expression. You've created a spot that everybody is supposed to land on. Now, again, it's not bad. It is reality, but it can become oppressive. So the example that I often use is when I was a pastor of a multi-ethnic church, we were racially, ethnically diverse. And back in the 90s, when we were starting the church, that was kind of unheard of to have this racial diversity in our church. So I remember looking around my leadership team one time and kind of seeing this real incredible diversity around the table. Then I realized that the African-American member of my board was a Yale graduate. The Caribbean-American member of my board was a Dartmouth graduate. The Puerto Rican-American member of my board was a Columbia and Harvard graduate. And kind of going around the table, and everybody was an Ivy League graduate. And so even though we were racially diverse, we had created a culture of kind of hyper intellectual, and we were in Cambridge. I mean, we were right between Harvard and MIT, so we're getting all these grad students from Harvard and MIT, and kind of these world-class students. So we ended up creating a third culture where race wasn't our distinguishing line; it was actually education. And so third culture in that sense can be oppressive, because people come into the church and say, wait, I didn't go to an Ivy League school. Do I belong here? Can I join a board if I didn't join, if I didn't go to Harvard or MIT? That actually became one of the questions that people started asking. Hey, I only went to, University of Massachusetts. Am I okay? Am I allowed to be here? So we created a culture where it created, an oppressive community, in that certain people were, you know, again, regardless of race at that point, it really became an issue of education. And so the consciousness piece actually hopefully moves us beyond that. And that, again, is Eldon's work. Eldon, of course, is building first on Elizondo's work, the Galilean Journey, who's also, both of them are picking up from Du Bois's work on double consciousness. And Du Bois sees double consciousness as a burden. He sees it as the burden of the Black person going back and forth between the white world, like corporate America, and then the Black world, his neighborhood, his church. And Du Bois kind of talks about this kind of, you know, we would call it now code switching, to have to switch codes from being in a white world to a Black world. Even the way you dress, right? You go to corporate America, you dress a certain way. But when you go to the Black church on Sunday, there's a different way you can dress. It's still nice. It's still really nice, but it's different. The Black neighborhood, the Black schools, the Black churches have a different consciousness. Now, again, Du Bois saw that as a burden to have to constantly code switch back and forth between the Black world and the white world. Elizondo and Villafañe are looking at this maybe a little more positively, to say that the triple consciousness, and they're looking at second generation Latino Americans who are primary English speakers, that they live in this triple consciousness world. They live in the world of their parents where Spanish is the primary language. They eat rice and beans, and the music and the culture is very Latino Hispanic culture. But then they go into corporate America, or they go to their school, or they go to their job, and it's a majority culture, you know, culture. But then they connect with each other. And it's a unique culture because they have that kind of multicultural reality in common. That's where I think we should start moving towards. Not so much is there a culture that everybody has to adapt to, because then you're just repeating the same mistakes of it's a white culture or Black culture. No, we have a Black-white culture combined. It's unique, but you still have to adapt to it. You still have to adjust to who we are. Versus, and this was interesting when I started the church in '96. Again, I kind of looked around the table of my initial church planning team. And the one thing we noticed we had in common, we were all immigrants or children of immigrants. There was a Caucasian brother. His father was a German immigrant, and he grew up understanding German culture and crossing between German culture and majority culture. Danny, his father was Bolivian. His mom was Bolivian. His father was Italian. Both were immigrants. I don't know how they spoke to each other. Apparently, there's enough Italian and Spanish correlates, cognates to be able to talk to each other. But he, you know, was a child of immigrants. He looked white, but he was a child of two immigrant family lines. I was a second generation immigrant. So we looked around and said, all of us have that commonality of immigration. And actually, many were biracial children. That was one of the key things I noticed early on as well, biracial children kind of finding their home. So they had lived almost all of their lives in this kind of liminal state. I forgot who wrote about that, as a theologian who used that language. And because they lived in this liminal state, kind of grew up in that. And that's why second generation Asian Americans, second generation Latinos have always grown up in that liminal state. Many African Americans have grown up in that liminal state. That actually creates a capacity to cross cultures. And so Villafañe and Elizondo look at that not as a curse, but as a blessing. The capacity to be in multicultural situations and settings and to kind of adjust and adapt in these different settings. There's a Korean American fiction writer named Chang Rae Lee. He wrote a book called Native Speaker about 20 years ago. And in that book, he talks about the central character is He's someone who came to the U.S. when he was 8. He's a Korean person. But he talks about, because English is a second language, he always has to think before he speaks. He can't just speak off the top of his head. But what it does is it creates an extra layer of sensitivity of what he says, because he's constantly translating in his mind. So that, and you all know this, that if you learn 2 languages when you're growing up, the education level and cognitive level usually is much higher than those who learn 1 language growing up. So the Chang Rae Lee's character, having to switch back and forth in his mind all the time, actually creates for him the capacity to cross cultures. I would say that's disciplable, to teach not a cultural norm that you've adapted in the church that everybody has to adjust to, but to teach consciousness intuition, cross-cultural ability that actually can help you, relate not just to one culture, but to multiple cultures. So two examples of this. One is a sociologist, a French sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu talks about the best, I don't think he's referencing basketball here, but that's the only connection I can make to this. He talks about the feel for the game, that someone develops a feel for the game. Now, some of that is coming from deconstructionist semiotics language, but the idea there is that the person has figured out how to operate within the rules, even if the rules are not necessarily explicit, right? So when you're in a setting long enough, you learn the code, you learn the language, you learn the culture, and you adapt to it. You develop a feel for the game. And that's where I think I'm kind of moving multiculturalism towards. Not, is there an inside and outside? Is there, do I learn 6 things and I've learned it well, and that's how I'm going to do it. So for me, for example, a lot of my formation was in the Black church. So when I started the church in Cambridge, the first thing I did is I went to 9 African-American pastors and asked them to disciple me. And 8 of them said yes, and all 8 of them followed through. And to this day, they're dear friends of mine, they're bishops of mine, they're pastors of mine. And my formation in ministry was actually, I grew up in the Korean church, but my formation as a pastor was very much because of these African-American pastors who were mentoring over me. What that did is actually it gave me a capacity to cross cultures in another area. So when I started doing some work in the Native American communities, very different culture, very different framework, very different reference points. But some of the patterns, the feel for the game that I learned by being under the leadership of Black pastors were the same patterns that I could apply in my relationship with Native American pastors. The postures, whether it's humility or the posture of learning, those things were translatable. Again, the cultures, Native and African American cultures, are very different. But because I had had that experience of being discipled in the Black church, when I started interacting with the Native church and also the Latino churches, I actually had learned that skill set, the feel for the game. That's where I would say churches should begin to move towards. Not, is there a set culture that everybody should adapt to, but is there a capacity that we're developing? That's real multiculturalism. I mean, Black-white is multiculturalism. That's a little bit, I don't say it's easier, but the boundaries are clearer because you have Black culture, white culture, but then you start bringing in Native American communities, Asian communities, Latino communities. You can learn to say hi in 15 languages, but that's pretty much it. If you really want to go deeper, you're going to have to learn, again, the feel for the game, the sense of cultural intuition that allows you to navigate, and that's more of a consciousness than it is a concrete culture.
Thank you, Dr. Rah. I saw one hand, so I'm going to go to James, let him ask his question. If we can get to you, Lance, as well, we'll get to you. But let's, James, go ahead.
I'll keep my answer shorter.
Dr. Rah, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here with us. My question has to do, my question is, how does the church know when they are diverse enough, that they are doing enough to be considered themselves being biblical?
That's a great question. There are kind of numerical metrics that people have been using. I don't like them. The numerical metric has been 80% of one group and 20% of another. And this was initially proposed, I believe, by Michael Emerson, who was my provost here at North Park. He's written some phenomenal books. He's actually a sociologist. Some of you know that's his training. He actually now is back in training PhD students in sociology. But what Michael looks at is, and that's kind of a numbers game. Michael's a demographer by training. And when you have 1 and 4, which is the 20%, 80%, chances are, numerically, sociologically, you will have 5 friendships, close friendships in any kind of social setting. So statistically, you will probably have a cross-cultural friendship. So that's where that number comes from, by the way. It's not some magic number. It's just a simple formula that says if you are in a setting where 1 out of 5 is different, then chances are you will have at least one cross-cultural relationship or friendship. So, I mean, we can look at that numerically and say, okay, that's a metric we want to shoot for. I think you can get to that numerical metric or the goal of that numerical metric without the numbers, right? So I can't say, okay, at this stage, at this number, at this point, you've attained multiculturalism. I would say more, even if you don't have that 1-to-4 ratio, are there cross-cultural relationships that are genuinely, authentically being worked out? Are there genuine mentorship across the cultures? So I would say kind of more the quality issue than the quantity issue. So look for the qualitative metrics of when you think about, and I hesitate to give you the specific ones because it varies from church to church. Some say our metric is worship. If our worship is diverse, or if our worship life is very central to our church, and if our worship begins to show that diversity, then in a key metric, you've shown diversity. Yeah.
So sorry. Thank you for answering that question. I had a follow-up question to that.
Sure.
So if the goal is, if we want to have a biblical church, then the goal should be to have a diverse church, a multicultural church. So is it unbiblical to start a church that really only appeals to like a Latin community, a Hispanic community, where basically 95 or maybe 100% of the people that go there are just Hispanic?
No, because here's again, it goes back to what Michael said in Michael Emerson said in one of his books. All churches, when possible, should be multi-ethnic. So this was the mantra that he wrote, I believe in United by Faith. What people heard, they dropped off the when possible and just went, all churches should be multi-ethnic. And I don't agree with that. I agree with what Michael said. I don't agree with what became of that phrase, all churches should be multi-ethnic. Because I think that there are places, where we should have communities that empower in ways that are appropriate for the people group. So the example I use is my mom is 80 years old. She used to come to my church when I was pastoring. She was in her 60s back then, and she would sit in the back and not pay attention to my sermon. And I would get deeply offended. Mom, you're my mom. You're not paying attention to my sermon. And she was very blunt. I don't understand a word you're saying. You're speaking in English. You talk so fast. Her primary language is Korean. So do I force her to say, Mom, your son is a multi-ethnic church pastor. You must go to a multi-ethnic church. Or do I say, you know what? I love my mom and I, respect and honor my mom. And the best way to do that is for her to find a community where she is really ministered to. Because as I say, for when she was working 6 days out of the week, she was completely marginalized. She was a single mom in the inner city neighborhood, working in this kind of inner city sub shop, 12 hours a day. And then I say, Mom, you're uncomfortable in your workspace 6 days out of the week. And then on Sunday, you also need to be uncomfortable in your space as well. That just didn't feel right to me. So, if I'm thinking of a community that has been marginalized, a Spanish-speaking community, for example, where their work is, they work in a different language than they're comfortable with, they're put down in their setting constantly, and that's the experience my mom had as what someone identified as a lower class, servant class person, but when she went to the church, in her Korean church, she was an elder, she was a prayer warrior. And she was a respected woman of God, whereas society saw her as a single mom, welfare queen who couldn't, who had to take food stamps and who was working long hours at making sandwiches and subs for the inner city neighborhood. So that's where I would say there are certain communities where society has so marginalized them, and the only place where some of that restoration of the image of God can occur is in the church. I'm not sure I would want to take that away from them.
Thank you. Last question. My apologies to the class that we weren't able to get to all your questions. I know Scott Johnson there would have a lot of questions, I think, with respect to worship. And I'll just give kudos. Soong-Chan Rah's church in Cambridge had a very diverse expression of worship where you wouldn't really tell what culture it was expressing, just as a quick FYI. And my apologies, we can't go there. But Lance, you get the privilege of the last question of the day with Dr. Rah. So go for it. Make it a good one.
Oh man, great, thanks. It's actually kind of similar to the last one. I'm part of a large campus ministry, and I would say that we major in more ethnic specific ministry as opposed to multi-ethnic ministry, and kind of how you go about the two, doing them well, especially as I mean, you mentioned a little bit in this, but talk about more of the HUP principle, maybe in regards to ethnic specific ministry, and yeah, the balance between engaging specific ethnicities versus building into multi-ethnic.
Yes. So to me, it looks, I feel like it has to be a both and. It can't be an all or nothing proposition. So the dysfunction of the homogeneous unit principle was that it became the method of doing church for decades. And again, it's a narrative that got embedded in. And so a lot of what we're kind of going up against now is fighting the principle of HUP that got so embedded in that people assume, well, if you really want a growing church, that's the way to do it. Now, that started changing in the last 10, 15 years because the demographics changed, number one, but also people were seeing successful multi-ethnic churches. But very few multi-ethnic churches are what we would account for as mega churches. Most mega churches are still, one race, definitely one class, So the idea of the homogeneity principle still lingers around that stream of kind of the church growth theories and the mega churches. But I would say that, again, it's a both and type of thing. I think 5 years ago, the number of quote unquote multi-ethnic churches, again, using the 2080 principle, crossed double digits for the first time. It had been hovering around 3 to 5% for the last 100 years or so. Which I thought was actually probably an overestimate. But over the last 10, 15 years, with more awareness and certainly a lot more literature on multi-ethnic churches and more church plants, for example, or more churches being intentionally trying to become multi-ethnic, that number has now moved up to above the 10% threshold. That still is too low, right? So, I'm saying it's not 100%, but 10% is still too low. So this is where I look at, okay, there are certain communities that I think we still need to affirm their need for single ethnic services. And Emerson, Kim, Yancey, and DeYoung wrote a book about this, United by Faith, where they gave some examples of, you still need the Black church in many iterations. You still need the immigrant churches, Spanish-speaking congregations. But even with all those exceptions, we're still way, way under the number of churches that could be multi-ethnic. So I would say with the both and rule would be, we should be affirming the role of ethnic specific churches, especially for disenfranchised communities or for transitional communities. And that I would say is maybe one of the key things working in campus ministry, for example, or in kind of majority culture white churches where they're not in areas that could become diverse. And that's a lot of churches right now where, we still have segregation in our communities. So for those churches, I would say this is a great time to train your children to be ready for what will happen in 20, 30 years. Because when those children, and you see this in college, right? The diversity they encounter in the university is so much more than what they encountered in their home church that many of them, it's kind of a cognitive dissonance. In fact, again, I think there's Emerson's statistic on this. Local schools are 6 times more diverse than local churches. So that's the threshold we have to kind of take a look at. So there are diverse neighborhoods, there aren't diverse churches. So what I'm arguing for is, do we need all churches to be multi-ethnic? No, but we need more churches to be multi-ethnic. But there are multiple paths to get there. One, can we train up the next generation? So if you're a Korean church, to look at the next generation, the second, third generation Korean Americans and say, I need to give them some cultural competency if they're going to not just make it in the church, but make it in the world. They've got to learn some of these things if they're going to make it in the world. If you had an all-white church and an all-white community, I've got to give them some cultural competency. I've got to give them some deeper history so that when they go out into a world that is diverse, that is inevitable, that is already happening, they're going to be ready for it. So I think we do have a number of people who are ready and wanting and jumping onto the vision of multi-ethnic churches, whether that's transitioning, more likely they're church planning. We've got to strengthen those numbers and increase those numbers. But I would say we also have to do the both and work of how do we raise up a next generation or the current generation, college students, current seminary students, so that they're ready to take on what's happening in the next 10, 20 years. Unfortunately, I think we should have started this 10, 20 years ago, but yeah, let's start now. Maybe it's not too late for us to say, okay, you're in an all-white neighborhood in St. Louis, in a farming community in Missouri. So, well, we can't become multi-ethnic. You're right, you can't, but you can prepare the next generation or your congregation for the inevitable diversity that is already in the works. And, you know, even little things like the illustrations that we use can go a long way. The stories that we tell from our sermons can go a long way. I don't think I wrote about it in this book, but one of the first things that I started demonstrating for my sermons was actually using illustrations that they hadn't heard before. And even like turning over my pulpit, the first person that ever preached at my church was Zina Jacques. She's an African-American woman who was a pastor, and you know, and I made a big deal of it. The very first person that I'm turning the pulpit over to as a church plant is Zina, who's been in this neighborhood for years, and she's going to speak to us you know. And so those kinds of demonstrations become a way that mono-ethnic communities become discipled into getting ready for what comes next.
Dr. Rah, thank you so much for your time. I did mention in an email, you know, I reference you as Hyung, and it's a Korean word for older brother. And I'm thankful that you are indeed one who has gone before me, even in leading in so many different ways. And so as the class, if we can, you went 10 minutes over, which is great too. Thank you for extending your time. But let's just give a blessing by maybe a round of applause, I guess, to Dr. Rah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your insight and again, spending time with our Covenant students, and hopefully another time we can interact with one another again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm going to sign off.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Class, if you could stay on for a little bit. All right, thank you. All right, here we go. So really quick, just housekeeping things. So I'm not going to be here next week, and that was kind of a somewhat last minute thing. I'm actually going to be in Boston on a vacation, and so I was going to try to do my call while I was on vacation, but I'm going to try to observe Good Sabbath, and actually it's more of the exhortation of my wife, and so if I could, I would, and so I ended up getting Dr. Bars, or Jerem Bars, to come in as well. So Jerem and Mike are going to co-lead next week, and it's going to be all on the idea of, you know, action. So how do we actually do it? And I think as our resident kind of apologetics, Francis Schaefer guy as well, he has a lot of insight specifically regards. He actually volunteered, by the way, at the start of this. He said, hey, Robert, you're teaching a class on cultural intelligence. I actually want to get involved. And so it was one of those things where I just said, hey, what a great opportunity. So he's going to come next week. Mike and Jerem have a great relationship as well. So it should be a great time and a blessing for you all as well. A quick administrative thing. So next week, your action plan or your formation plan around the 4 CQ factors. And again, what I wanted you to do, let me just explain it in person, is take your IDI, where your profile was, go around the 4 factors and say, how can you begin to implement? And I think actually segueing off of today's talk, you actually have a lot of opportunity to say, here's how I'm going to form myself in one of those 4. You're going to use all 4, right? So motivation, knowledge, action, strategy, action. But you have a lot of fodder, I think, off of today to say, oh, I know where I can add that. I can add it here, right? Does that make sense? And so you're going to do that as just a formation plan. It's really more personal. If you can integrate some of the readings and writings that you were assigned to, that might be helpful as well. But that's kind of what the assignment is for next week, all right? And I'm going to cue you in because I had a question on the biblical reconciliation plan. So the biblical reconciliation plan, that assignment, and I wanted to have you guys search your hearts with respect to this. If you're honest with yourself, there's a cultural group that you have a hard time relating to, perhaps loving, getting along, whatever word you want to use, right? The paper has in mind, 1, be assigned to the fact that you are a minister of reconciliation, but how would you apply to that specific context? How does scripture even lead you, right, accordingly to be a ministry of reconciliation in that context? So I met with someone yesterday who asked me some questions about the paper, and I said, tell me the group you have the hardest time with. And he actually was just honest. He's like, Muslims. And so I said, your biblical reconciliation plan is going to see how does scripture apply in your particular context to love and reconcile with Muslims in your life? That's the reconciliation paper that you're assigned at the last part of class. All right, so if you can think about that, that's kind of where we're headed. Dr. Higgins, do you have anything else you want to add?
I just want to add that that was really helpful to me. Yeah, I mean, Rah, he's awesome, and just looking forward to next week.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, great. Thanks for being with us, you all. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.